What if I told you your literature review should be the most compelling part of your paper? How would you change your writing or your citation practices? Hey co-authors, in this episode we explore the 3 most common pitfalls in literature reviews and show you how to transform your review into a focused, engaging narrative. You'll learn why tone and structure matter just as much as content and discover practical tools to map the scholarly conversation, stay organized, and guide your reader from the big picture problem to the specific research questions. So let's dive in. So let me age myself a little bit here. Whenever I wrote my very first literature review, I was in high school, and my English teacher took us to the library, and once we picked out our topics, we had to look up our books through the card catalog system, those long drawers that have the little pieces of paper that has the title and the author and the Library of Congress number and all that stuff, so that way you can find it. And so you get all these books together. There was not really access to the internet, at least not in a way of accessing things like journal articles, or even news sites really weren't a thing yet. And so everything was done through the card catalog and books. And once you got all those books together, then you got your note cards out and you wrote notes to yourself as you read your book, the things that you wanted out of those books. So that way you could put that in your literature review. And so then whenever you got time for you to write your literature review, you had all of these note cards and you basically summarized each one of the important things out of those note cards into a running document that was 20 pages long. And I remember just thinking, oh my God, 20 pages, it's so long. How am I ever going to fill that up? And all you were really doing was just reading stuff and then summarizing that and putting that onto the note card and then onto a piece of paper and then typing that out on your computer. I will say we at least had computers that we could type it out on. I didn't have to handwrite my paper, just the note cards. I bring this up because I think that a lot of times whenever people are writing literature reviews, they have this same sort of approach to writing their literature reviews. They read a whole bunch of stuff and then they try to summarize that stuff, and that's what they call a literature review. And I mean, that makes some sense. I mean, your high school or even your undergraduate writing classes may have taught you to write like that. That's how we teach beginning writers to write things, is, read a whole bunch of stuff and then summarize it. I think part of it is that people don't know what's important, and so they just summarize everything in the hope that they hit somewhere in the field of what's right. While on some level, obviously, it's important for you to be able to read, digest, understand, and summarize information. That's not what a literature review is. And in fact, I think it's kind of a misnomer to call it a review of literature or a literature review, because oftentimes we are not doing a dispassionate, exhaustive literature review. What we are doing is selecting literature that helps us craft an argument or craft a narrative or craft a reason for our reader to understand what it is that we are writing about, why it's important for us to write about that thing, and then how the literature that's gone on before narrows us down into our hypotheses or research questions, research purpose, argument, whatever it might be. And so the purpose of the literature review is to showcase a practical, theoretical, methodological, conceptual issue that is of importance to the reader, and then walking me through the literature that helps me understand how you're addressing that gap. So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the typical problems that I see writers make whenever they're trying to write their literature reviews. And then I want to discuss some practices that you can engage in order for you to level up your literature reviews and really make them communicate the importance of your work to your audience and the stakes of the conversation that you're trying to have. So let's dive in. Are you interested in mastering scholarly writing, developing productivity, and increasing impact, all while staying healthy? Then welcome to the Publishing Academic Research Podcast. Hi, my name is Dr. Kyle Reddick, and I'm a full professor at the University of Northern Iowa. I've written dozens of articles, books, chapters, and essays, as well as edited some of the top journals in my discipline. I meet so many scholars who have creative, innovative, and daring ideas, but can never seem to get those projects from proposals to print. I want you to get your work in the hands of people who will read it and appreciate it. So let's get into this week's big idea. So before we jump into the 3 common problems that I see, I just want to talk a little bit about why a compelling literature review matters so much. A compelling literature review is one that does a good job of addressing the most relevant literature. It engages the reader by having a clear, logical flow that connects the introduction, that should talk about the big picture problem that this research is addressing, which we talked about in one of our previous episodes about writing introductions. but it should provide a through line from that introduction into your research questions, hypotheses, or main research purpose. Ultimately, it's setting up the rest of your study. The tone of your literature review is going to tell me what your theoretical or paradigmatic assumptions are. It's going to tell me a lot about you as an author, right? So a good, compelling literature review, it's not just about the content in there, although obviously that's really important, but the sort of meta story that your literature review is telling is a story about you, what literature you include and you don't include, how you report on that literature. All those things are telling me about you as an author. So it's incredibly important that your literature review is conveying not just through content, but through its tone and its representation, that you're a credible, trustworthy source for me as a reader. Because if I don't trust you in the literature review, I sure as heck am not going to trust you to have carried out a rigorous methodology and to have come up with results or findings that then I can rely on in my own research. So with that in mind, what are 3 common problems that I see in literature reviews? The first one, and I kind of touched on this a little bit already, is what I call the summarization trap. This is particularly true for newer writers, but I sometimes also see it with faculty who don't write that much. I will start reading the literature review, and each paragraph is a summarization of one article. So one paragraph, one article, one paragraph, one article, one paragraph, one article. And I mean, at best, that's kind of an annotated bibliography, but it's not even really that. It's just an endless series of summarizations. And there's a couple of problems with this. The first one is that it's just disjointed. There is not a logical flow that is guiding me through the writing. Instead, everything is piecemeal. That leads to the second problem, which is that you as the author might understand why all these things are connected, but you're not making that explicit to your reader. And so as a reader then, I am left with permission to read these summaries and to come to my own conclusions about how they connect. Well, you don't want that. You don't want me as a reader herring off and coming up with my own conclusions about things. Your job is to guide me to your preferred meaning, because that preferred meaning is what's ultimately framing your study. So if I read a series of summaries and I come up with a different sense of what that literature is telling me, then in that case, by the time I get to the end of the literature review, I read your research question or hypothesis and I'm like, what the heck is this? This is not where I thought they were going to go with this. This is not the gap that I thought they were going to address. This is not the problem I thought that they were trying to work on. I'm sitting there confused as to why you chose this dynamic to look at whenever I came with this different reading of your work. The last reason why this is, I think, bad writing is just because it's just boring writing. Oh my God. Just reading an endless series of summaries is boring. Stop boring me. As a reviewer or as an editor, we have so much to do. And the last thing that I want to do is to slog through 5, 10, 15 pages of summary. I want you to communicate what your problem is and what the stakes of your conversation are. I want you to compel me to care about this issue as much as you do, because you do care about it. That's why you chose this dynamic to write your journal article on, or your thesis on, your dissertation on, or whatever it might be. You're passionate about this thing. I want to be passionate about it too. I want to be passionate for your writing, and it's really hard to do that whenever, instead of having engaging writing, I have an endless series of paragraphs. That's what this person said, and then this person said this, and then this person said that. That's boring. Don't be boring. So that leads to the second problem, which is that the folks that are not just doing an endless series of summaries, instead they have more than one piece of literature appearing in each paragraph, but it really kind of lacks a clear organizational logic. It just seems like it's a bunch of information that's been dumped onto me as the reader without really a care for how I'm supposed to be making sense of it. And again, I just want to say, as a reader, you do not want me herring off and making my own assumptions about what you're trying to do with your literature. So why do we see this lack of organizational logic? One reason why people sort of lack this organizational logic is that they're reading to understand what's in the literature. And as they're reading that literature, they're trying to write. And so you can kind of see their ideas being pulled in different directions as they read this thing and then that thing, because there's not an overall clear sense of how all of this literature is fitting together. Instead, each piece of literature kind of stands on its own or stands against other pieces of literature. I guess as sort of a metaphor for this would be, it's the difference between seeing the literature sing as a choir and then having just a bunch of soloists together, right? Like, yeah, it's a group of people, much like a choir, but they all think that they're Whitney Houston or Beyonce or whoever. So they're all singing as soloists without really any regard for what the other singers are doing. Even if they individually sound good, as a group of people, they don't sound good. You want a choir. You want your literature to fit together, and that each citation that you have is working with others so that as a whole, it sounds great because each citation is holding up their part and not infringing on anyone else's. So don't just expect that because you review literature or that you have a lot of citations that that's necessarily convincing your reader that what you have is a logic that is working towards securing or warranting your project. So the third problem that I oftentimes see in literature reviews is that it seems like people don't know what they're actually supposed to cite out of articles to put into their literature reviews. It's pretty common for me to see people citing or quoting things out of other articles, literature reviews, or introductions. Now, I will say, there are some times whenever you will want to cite things out of someone else's literature review or introduction. That might be because your project is addressing a flaw in their logic. So they cited something in their literature review which gave them the type of research design that they had, and so you disagree with that, so you're citing that in order for you to demarcate why your research is different and arguably better than their research. Or it might be that they, especially if you're doing more humanistic types of research where, literature reviews are not really their own standalone section in the same way that they are in social scientific writing. So in more humanistic writing, rhetorical criticism, cultural criticism, those forms of writing where literature analysis and your own argument are sort of interwoven into one another. Sometimes it's kind of hard to see, okay, is this a literature review or is this something I can cite or not? And so in those instances, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to figure out what you should cite and what you shouldn't cite out of those types of scholarship. But here I'm primarily talking about young scholars who download an article to read. It's 20, 25, 30, 35 pages long. Oh my God, the idea of sitting down and reading this thing from beginning to end, it's so daunting. The language is complex. It's kind of making my head hurt. Maybe I need to go to the bathroom. I want to play a video game. I need to check my social media, whatever it might be, right? But all that is to say that sitting down and reading an article from beginning to end is an incredibly time-consuming and intellectually and mentally challenging thing. And the idea of reading enough for an entire literature review, reading 5, 10, 15, 20 articles or more, all of a sudden becomes very daunting. So I read someone else's literature review. I get 1, maybe 2 pages in. Oh, that was an interesting snippet there. That was a cool quote there. That was an interesting finding from this other study. I'll just go ahead and cite that right now. As a general rule, you should not be citing things from other people's literature reviews in your literature review. Their literature review is a review of past results and findings and discussions. The actual thing that article generated as new knowledge. Then they used that to create their own research where they generated their own findings, results, discussion. So that's their generation of new knowledge. You should not review their review of literature. If we were all just reviewing each other's literature reviews, eventually you would be doing a review of a review of a review of a review. You're not actually reviewing the literature anymore. You're just playing the telephone game. Whenever I'm reading a literature review and I see consistently that you're quoting or citing things from the first 2, 3, 4, 5 pages of an article, then I know that you haven't read the whole thing, right? I read through your literature review and it just so happens that nothing that you've ever cited ever goes past page 4 of anything that you've ever cited. Okay, well then you're a lazy writer. Right? That means that you never actually read all the way through the study. You never actually figured out what the actual findings or discussion of that article was. You read to the point of the article that you found something that you were like, oh, well, that's a nice little tidbit there. That's something that I can use. Threw that into your paper and called it good. That's not research. That's not good writing. That's not your duty as a writer. Right? That is a dereliction of your responsibility as a writer of academic research. you need to be engaging in the entire article and especially in the discussion and results of articles. That way you can adequately report what the actual new knowledge was that was generated by each piece of literature that is forming your literature review. At this point, we've talked about 3 common problems that I see with folks whenever they're writing their literature reviews. So what are some ways that we can address those? Well, I've got 3 tools for you that might be helpful for you as you're working through your literature review for your project. First off, I think it's important to recognize what kind of tools you have at your disposal to help you find the literature that you need for your literature review. So even though we don't want to cite things out of other people's literature reviews, we do want to make sure that whenever we're approaching our topic, that we don't feel the need to reinvent the wheel as it comes to representing what the scholarly conversation is or has been about this topic. Typically, I try to look at their references and then see what references are common across those 3, 4, 5 articles. If you do that, that's going to help you recognize then what in the past seems to be major touchstones in the conversation about this topic. It's also going to point you to foundational pieces, meta-analyses, updates to theories or concepts, any of those big picture things that are pivotal points in that conversation are going to be cited across multiple sources about whatever topic it is that you're trying to address. So finding those articles and then looking at their references and finding the commonalities, that's point number 1. That's going to tell you what stuff has happened in the past that's led up to this current moment in the conversation that you're trying to have. The other tool that you can use is Google Scholar. One of the things that I really like about the way that Google Scholar works is that once you've figured out those pivotal pieces, the major projects that are informing the conversation, then you can put that project into Google Scholar. It will then bring it up, and then it will have the cited by link at the bottom of that. So now you can see every piece that Google Scholar knows has cited that piece that you already know is pretty foundational because you found it across the 3, 4, or 5 articles that you looked at. But now you can find the 10, 20, 100, 200 articles, books, white papers, whatever it might be, that are citing this source. So that way now you have all the things that pivotal piece has influenced. This gives you a really good way of understanding both the past and the present of what's going on in this scholarly conversation. Now, I will say one thing about Google Scholar that I do not like is that Google Scholar picks up just about anything that styles itself as a journal or as a scholarly outlet. I have so many times whenever students in particular put whatever it is that they want in Google Scholar, it pops up. Well, it must be scholarly. It's in Google Scholar, right? It's in the name. But, what it might be hitting is some fly-by-night predatory journal, some, absolutely unreliable, uncredible source. There's nothing in the Google Scholar algorithm that assesses quality. For that, you're going to want to go to something like EBSCOhost or, the OneSearch academic file or whatever it is that your particular discipline is using as a search database. But Google Scholar does not do that for you. So it will pick up anything that's ever cited the piece that you're looking for, but some of those citations are not things that you want to use. So we'll talk in another episode about how to figure out what's a good source or not. But for right now, just know that you might be grabbing on to a lot of things that you don't want. The second thing to do, and this has always been particularly difficult for me to do as an ADHD person, right? I oftentimes kind of do the ADHD focus where you start chasing an idea down a rabbit hole. And next thing you know, you've got all of these sources that you've made notes from, or maybe you've copied quotes and put them in a file, whatever it might be. And then you look back and you're like, I don't remember where any of these things were that I found. So, you just kind of chase the dragon and, you never catch the dragon. The first thing that I'll do is put the citation information at the top of the page. And then after that, I will have a separate Microsoft Word file or Google Doc, whatever it is that you want to use, but I'll have a separate saved file for each source that I am taking this information from. That way, if it's an electronic copy, that makes it even easier because then I can put the information at the top of the page and then I can just copy and paste from whatever file I'm looking at electronically into whatever file that I'm keeping, whether that's a Microsoft Word or Google Doc file. That being said, It's really important for you that as you're going through all of these sources, that you're keeping organized notes. Whenever I read things, if it is a print copy like a book or maybe a journal article that I've gotten from the library, I will usually sit at a computer as I'm reading that thing. And if something is important to me, I will quote verbatim whatever it is in the text, and I will put that text, I will either highlight it in yellow or I'll do something to notate that that's a quote, put the page number, all those things. And then I'll write a little note to myself about what I think the quote means, how I think that it might connect to my project, whatever it might be. What's important though is that you're making those copies word for word, but then you're writing notes to yourself about how that's connected to your project and why you think it's important. You want to make sure that in those instances where you are writing to understand the material, that is happening here in your notes and not on the page of your lit review. If you're writing to understand in your literature review, you're showing your reader that you don't understand things, right? Because your analysis keeps moving as you encounter new stuff. But instead, you have all of that cognitive work in these files, so that way you can come back to it. The other good thing about this is that as you develop a program of research and you start developing projects beyond the one that you're looking at right now, but that are still connected to this research topic, this work that you've done never goes away. You've got all these notes on all of these writings. And so whenever you finish this project and you go to the next one, oh, look, I've already read all of this stuff and I've got my notes, and all that can help me remember why this stuff's important, and it goes into your lit review with a lot less hassle. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time because you've got all of this information in one area. The final thing that you can do to help you develop a clear organizational framework is creating subheadings within your sections to make sure that you're staying very specific throughout your literature review. And you can keep those subheadings in if they seem to make sense, or you can remove them after you've completed your literature review if you don't feel like they're helping your reader. I would recommend that if you are thinking of keeping them in, the advice that I got and that I think has been helpful for me has been you should never have a subheading within a section that is less than 3 paragraphs. So if I have a major section called literature review, and let's say I have a section on a theory that I'm using, let's just pull one out of the hat, relational dialectics theory. And then I want to apply that to the way that romantic couples negotiate who gets the dog whenever they break up, right? My personal nightmare, by the way. My partner and I have a dog. Honestly, I think that it would have to be a King Solomon solution if we were to ever break up. Luckily, I don't think that's going to happen. But anyway, back to this idea. We have a theory, relational dialectics theory. We have a context, right? We have the negotiation of competing interests on who gets the dog. So those might be 2 subsections within my section of literature review, right? So I might have the name literature review as a level 1 heading. I might have 1 paragraph after that helps orient my reader as to what I'm going to try to do in the literature review, but no more than 1 paragraph. You might not even have that. After that, though, you have your first subheading, and that should be the name of the theory, in this case, relational dialectics theory. You should not have fewer than 3 paragraphs in that section. If you only have 1 paragraph, that doesn't require a subsection. That's just 1 paragraph, right? If you have 2 paragraphs, maybe, but honestly, having at least 3 gives you the space to introduce a concept, get into it in the second paragraph, have a full transition in the third paragraph. It's really hard to accomplish that in just 2 paragraphs. If you need more than 3, that's cool, right? Then you have your next subsection, that's negotiation of competing interests, and you review all the literature about that specific dynamic. Not all of the literature on that dynamic is going to be influenced by relational dialectics theory. That's okay. You're now doing a more concept level subheading. So your theory is sort of the bigger thing that's framing your concept. And then after you are done reviewing that literature, and then your transition paragraph, the final paragraph of that subsection, then becomes a really cool place where you can pull together, hey, so here's what we know about that concept. Here's why relational dialectics theory is such a good fit and maybe hasn't been used in the past to study this type of dynamic. And that's how it's pulling all of that together to give you your research question or your hypothesis or your research purpose or whatever it might be. But having this clear organizational framework then allows you to craft that argument, because that's what we're trying to do in this literature review, is create this argument that warrants for our reader and provides a logical through line from the literature that we're citing into our research question, hypothesis, or research purpose. If you look at writing guides, a lot of them are going to give you different types of structures like chronological, thematic, methodological, theoretical, all of those different things. In my experience, the two most frequent structures for organizing your literature review is thematic and theoretical. If it's thematic, usually you don't have an overarching theory that's guiding your research. You're not theory testing like a social scientist, or you're not using a sensitizing theoretical framework like a qualitative or interpretivistic scholar, right? Instead, you are looking for broad themes in the literature based on the dynamic that you're looking at. So you want to have a thematic through line of the major concepts that you're using to address whatever the issue or topic is that's framing your study. If you go back to the first two types of advice that I've given you, those approaches to gathering and writing through your literature review lend themselves very well to a thematic approach to your literature review. Another approach that I oftentimes see is theoretical. So that would be like my previous example, where you have a theory that frames the overall dynamic that you're trying to look at or test or whatever it might be. And then you might have the specific concepts or variables that you need to report on as they relate to that theory or as they might exist even beyond that theory. But in that case, you want to make sure that your theory is the thing that is up front. It's the first thing that is in your literature review, because as a writer, that theory should be framing all of the themes of the literature that you see and the ways that those things are connecting to one another, right? So the theory is guiding you and how you are framing the connections of the different variables or concepts or ideas or whatever it might be. As a reader, whenever I start with the theory, then I can see the sort of guiding logic that is moving me down from this more theoretical down to the particular part of your study. So whenever I get to your hypotheses or research questions or research purpose, I have that clear through line from the theory to the concepts to the specific research question, hypothesis, research purpose, whatever that might be. So again, as you're working through, right, put those subheadings in and use them as a way of helping to guide your reader, or write them to yourself and then take them out afterwards. I actually have a client right now where every paragraph she writes a subheading for it. And then once she's written her literature review, she takes all of those subheadings out except for the major ones that are framing her study. And I think that just helps her remember what the purpose of that particular paragraph is. And by having them all as subheadings of a major heading, that helps her remember, oh, I need to only write about the theory in this section because it's a subsection of the section of the theory. But again, at the end of that, she's taking all the subheadings out other than the major one, the one that says what her theory is, because as a reader, I don't want to have to read 10, 15, 20 subheadings that break up every paragraph. Your subheadings are there to help your reader. That's breaking things up to the point to where it's making it laborious for your reader to read. Don't do that. Don't bore your reader. You're writing research. It's not a best-selling novel, right? It's research. It's already, on some level, a little bit boring. I know that's maybe heresy to say because we're all interested in the things that we're doing, but it's already a little bit boring. There's no reason for you to make it a tough read for your reader as well. The content's hard enough. Don't make the form difficult to read as well. All right, folks. So as we wrap up here, the last thing that I will say is that a really good way of figuring out whether your literature review makes sense or not is to have someone else read it for you. Even having someone who maybe is not a colleague or a person that's in your area is also really strong. What you're looking for here is not content feedback. What you're looking for is are you creating an argument with your literature review that is easy to follow for your reader, that logically flows down to your research question, hypotheses, or research purpose. If you get feedback from someone and they're like, well, I didn't understand this part, or I didn't think this made sense, or this didn't really connect with me, your first reaction might be to try to explain to them what you meant on this page or in that paragraph or whatever it might be. But here's the deal. The problem with that is that you are not going to be able to do that for every person who reads your work. Currently, There's going to be hundreds, maybe thousands of people reading your work. You're not going to be able to address every time that you've written something vaguely and they have questions about what it is that you wrote. And certainly once you get published, that document might live for years, decades, maybe even centuries after you're dead. They can't dig up your zombie bones and ask you what you meant on page 2 of your literature review. You need to write in a way that's future-proofed for the meaning that you're trying to convey to your reader. You want to present them with a preferred reading of your work that guides them to see the same things that you do in the literature and in the logic that leads down to your research question, hypothesis, or research purpose. So having someone else, and particularly someone who's not a part of your discipline or your field, who can read your work just to see if it makes sense, regardless of content, can be a really good way of getting some feedback back and can be a way for you to work through that stuff as long as you are not defensive about your writing and you feel the need to correct them or explain to them why your writing is actually good. If it was that good, you wouldn't need to explain it to them. The last thing I will say is that, as always, I'm interested in the things that you all are doing to address this week's topic. So feel free to reach out to me. Let me know. What are the tips, tricks, habits, rituals, the things that you're doing or the things that you're teaching your students to help them write better literature reviews? I'm always looking for advice to give to my students and to give to my clients. And I'm also happy to give you a shout out the next time that I talk about this topic and say that this was an idea that came from you. So please send those things to me. I would love to feature your ideas on the podcast. Finally, if you're interested in developing your writing more, no matter what your project is, I'm happy to give you feedback, to read over your outline, to talk with you through ideas, whatever it might be that's helpful for you to get your work from that draft folder and into publication. So please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always interested in working with new clients, and I'd love to see if there's an opportunity for us to work together and help you achieve your goals in publishing your own research. So thank you all again, and I'll see you in next week's episode. Hey writers, what's stopping your best ideas from becoming your next big publication? Brilliant ideas shouldn't die in your drafts folder. Now's the time to bridge the gap between the possible and the published. If you have the time, I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe to the podcast, leave a positive review, assign this to your classes, or share it with a colleague. All those things help get the word out and let me know what I can do to make this podcast the best resource for you. Also, if you'd like to set up a time to chat with me about your next big idea, then you can find my information in the podcast description where you can schedule a time. So until then, keep healthy, keep writing, and don't let reviewer 2 get you down.